July 24th, 1943. Somewhere outside Hamburg, deep inside a concrete bunker, Oberfunker Klaus Hartmann leaned toward his radar screen, a calm, circular glow he had stared at 1,000 nights before. Tonight, it betrayed him. Without warning, the clean, predictable sweep of the Würzburg radar dissolved into chaos. Dots multiplied like a living organism, first by dozens, then by hundreds, then by thousands. A solid wall of green light crawled across the glass, devouring the precise tracks his operators depended on. Hartmann froze. His training said, equipment failure. His instinct said this is impossible. Just minutes earlier, the Kammhuber Line, the pride of the Luftwaffe, the most advanced, integrated air defense network in the world, was fully awake. Freya stations on the coast had already plotted a typical RAF bomber stream approaching Germany. Searchlights were warming. Night fighters were climbing to intercept. Everything was routine. And then, instantly, everything was not. Radius erupted. Controllers barked orders that contradicted each other. Night fighters demanded vectors that no one could give. Flak batteries shouted for targets that no radar could provide. A system built on precision had entered total blindness. Hartmann rebooted the console, hands trembling. The same impossible blizzard reappeared, thousands of phantom echoes creeping toward Hamburg like a silent tidal wave. This cannot be real, he whispered into the headset. But it was, and it was only the beginning. What Hartmann didn't know, what no one in the entire Luftwaffe yet understood, was that this was not a malfunction, not sabotage, not a breakthrough Allied weapon. It was something far simpler, something so simple it had been dismissed, feared, banned, and forgotten. A weapon made of paper and aluminum, cut to a precise length. A weapon Germany had invented first, but refused to use. Tonight, falling silently from the bomb bays of 791 RAF aircraft, that weapon had returned home, and it was about to make the Reich blind. To understand what Klaus Hartmann saw on his radar that night, we have to go back 18 months, to a different room, a different set of minds, and a different kind of fear. Because the chaos on Hartmann's screen wasn't born in a bunker. It was born in laboratories, arguments, and boardrooms, where brilliant scientists and terrified commanders stared at the same discovery and reached the same conclusion. If we use this, we destroy ourselves. In early 1942, at the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Great Britain, a young physicist named Joan Curran stood over a desk scattered with thin strips of aluminum-coated paper. They fluttered as she lifted them, shimmering like children's craft scraps, fragile, weightless, harmless. But their measurements were anything but accidental. Each strip was cut to 27 centimeters, the exact half wavelength of the Würzburg radar used by German flak batteries and night fighters. Drop enough of them from an aircraft, Curran explained, and German radar would see thousands of false echoes. Not a formation of bombers, but a solid wall of ghosts. A radar blizzard. The same blizzard that would one day make Hartmann whisper, "This cannot be real." This idea had a name. Window. The Americans called it chaff, and in Germany, scientists working independently called it Duppel. Both sides had discovered the same revolution. Both sides immediately understood its power, and both sides froze, because the moment someone used it, they knew the other side would use it back. German radar engineers tested Duppel months before the British even finished debating it. They already knew the effect. When a handful of aircraft dropped their foil strips during trials, entire radar screens went blind, exactly as they would over Hamburg later. Hermann Göring was personally shown the demonstration. He watched his billion Reichsmark defensive network collapse under a handful of falling paper. He didn't see a weapon. He saw retaliation. He imagined British bombers dropping Duppel over Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, cities scorched during the Blitz, now left completely undefended. In seconds, Göring made one of the most consequential decisions of the war. He banned Duppel, not delayed it, not questioned it, banned it completely. All research locked away, all prototypes destroyed. Scientists ordered never to speak of it again. The Reich had invented a weapon powerful enough to blind its own defenses, and then chose blindness over risk. Across the Channel, British scientists were facing the same crisis of imagination. Window worked perfectly on paper. Curran's calculations were flawless. Small-scale tests confirmed everything. But using Window meant admitting a brutal reality. If the Germans copied it, chain home, Britain's early warning system, the very shield that saved Britain during the Blitz, could be crippled. No interception. Cities defenseless. The British High Command spiraled into the same fear. Sir Frederick Lindemann opposed using it. RAF Fighter Command opposed using it. Anti-Aircraft Command opposed using it. Home Secretary Herbert Morrison feared a second Blitz, far worse than the first. For 18 months, Britain had the weapon that could save its bombers, and locked it away. Just like Germany, Window wasn't a weapon. It was a mutual suicide pact, a tool so terrifying that neither side dared to use it first. But wars don't care about fear. They obey mathematics. And by mid-1943, the numbers were grim. RAF, bomber losses, 5–6% per mission, unsustainable survival rates for crews. The Kammhuber Line, intercepting up to 16% of attacking bombers, German night fighters growing more deadly every month. The Allies didn't need courage to use Window, they needed desperation. A choice between certain loss and possible catastrophe. In July 1943, desperation won. The order was signed. Window would be used over Hamburg, in quantities never tested, at a scale no radar operator on Earth had ever imagined. Men in London trembled at what Germany might do next. Men in Berlin didn't even know that their own banned invention was about to return, with the force of a hurricane made of ghosts. As 791 RAF bombers roared toward the German coast on July 24th, every aircraft carried bundles of Window, 1 bundle per minute, thousands of strips per bundle, millions of false echoes descending in slow motion. The Allies weren't just dropping bombs. They were dropping blindness. They were dropping fear itself. They were about to rewrite the rules of electronic warfare, with nothing more than aluminum scraps fluttering through the night. In a bunker outside Hamburg, Oberfunker Klaus Hartmann stared at his radar screen, believing it was malfunctioning. What he was actually watching was the end of an empire's vision, and the beginning of a new kind of war, one fought not with explosives, but with deception made visible, made from paper, cut with scissors, perfected by physics, and feared by every high command that ever touched it. Midnight, July 24th, 1943. Across the North Sea, 791 RAF bombers, Sterlings, Halifaxes, and Lancasters flew in a tight formation so vast it stretched across the night like a steel river. But this time, they were not alone. Inside every aircraft, packed into canvas sacks and cardboard boxes, lay the most dangerous weapon never meant to be used: 1-pound bundles of carefully cut aluminum foil Window. At 0:57 hours, as the bomber stream crossed the German coastline, the order was given: drop Window, 1 bundle every minute. A simple command, a quiet command. A command that detonated not with sound, but with silence. And with that silence, the greatest air defense network in Europe began to die. Midnight, July 24th, 1943. Across the North Sea, 791 RAF bombers, Sterlings, Halifaxes, and Lancasters flew in a tight formation so vast it stretched across the night like a steel river. But this time, they were not alone. Inside every aircraft, packed into canvas sacks and cardboard boxes, lay the most dangerous weapon never meant to be used: 1-pound bundles of carefully cut aluminum foil Window. At 0:57 hours, as the bomber's stream crossed the German coastline, the order was given: drop Window, 1 bundle every minute. A simple command, a quiet command, a command that detonated not with sound, but with silence. And with that silence, the greatest air defense network in Europe began to die. The first bundles tumbled into the cold night air, breaking apart, scattering 27-centimeter strips in glittering clouds. They fluttered slowly, deliberately designed to fall at just the right speed to remain in radar view for as long as possible. To the naked eye, they were nothing. To German radar, they were an invasion. A single Lancaster dropping window created thousands of false echoes. 700 Lancasters created millions. The radar horizon lit up like a Christmas tree exploding in slow motion. From the bunker, Hartmann's screen transformed into a glowing, seething mass of green static. Not dots, not tracks. A wall, an electronic avalanche, swallowing every real aircraft inside it. His voice cracked as he reported in. Thousands of signals. Impossible to distinguish. It wasn't equipment failure. It wasn't sabotage. It was the first large-scale demonstration of what happens when physics becomes a weapon. General Joseph Kammhuber's masterpiece, the meticulously engineered defensive grid stretching across occupied Europe, was designed to be invulnerable. Interlocking zones, radar plus searchlights, plus anti-aircraft guns, plus night fighters. A system that ate bombers alive. For 3 years, it had worked flawlessly. Now, in 5 minutes, it stopped working at all. Each radar station along the bomber path began reporting identical chaos. Screen saturated. Echoes uncountable. System blind. Cannot lock target. Request instructions. Instructions never came. Because no one in the Luftwaffe knew what was happening. Night fighters clawed through the sky, demanding vectors. Controllers shouted back blindly. Turn to heading no. Wait, ignore that multiple. Stand by, stand by. But there was nothing to stand by for. There were no targets. Only paper. Bombers that should have been hunted relentlessly now flew unchallenged. Invisible inside a storm of ghosts. Below the bomber stream, Hamburg's vast network of searchlights powered up, slicing the sky in white arcs. But just like the radar operators, searchlight crews were chasing phantoms. The beams jerked wildly, sweeping across empty sky, illuminating nothing but drifting fragments of window. Flak commanders, usually guided by precise Würzburg radar data, were now operating blind. Their radar, built to place an 88mm shell within 30 meters at 20,000 feet, was useless, flooded with false targets that made no mathematical sense. Forced to revert to First World War tactics, they fired blind barrage patterns into the darkness, hoping, praying for a lucky hit. None came. The bombers moved through Hamburg's defenses like ghosts passing through walls. With radar neutralized, the bombers reached their target with terrifying precision. Markers dropped, target indicators burned. And then, the city exploded in flame. The first wave dropped high explosives to tear open buildings and shatter water mains. The second wave dropped incendiaries, hundreds of thousands of them, into the ruptured heart of Hamburg. Without radar-guided flak or night fighters, there was nothing to stop the attack. The city burned uncontested. Temperatures reached Babeshushidu. Winds roared at 150 miles per hour. A firestorm. A phenomenon so violent it created its own weather. Entire neighborhoods were pulled into the inferno. This wasn't a bombing raid. It was a physics event. An entire metropolis torn open and consumed by heat. In the space of hours, over 42,000 civilians died, most from fire, some from smoke, others from the storm itself. Window didn't kill them, but it removed every defense that might have prevented their deaths. For the RAF, the numbers were staggering. 780 tons, bombers dispatched. Does lost. 1.5% loss rate. Down from 5-6%. A 75% reduction in casualties. Over 2,000 tons of bombs dropped. For the Luftwaffe, the numbers were catastrophic. Interception rate dropped from 16% to 0%. Every Würzburg radar was blinded. Every Freya early warning radar was saturated. Every night, fighters sent into the air returned empty-handed. The Kammhuber Line hadn't failed. It had been deleted, erased by something that cost less than a penny per strip. In Berlin, Alarmed officers pored over radar logs and after-action reports. The conclusion hit them with the force of a hammer. This is Doppel. The British had deployed the very weapon Germany developed first. The weapon Göring banned. The weapon that could have saved Hamburg. The weapon that could have crippled British defenses a year earlier. The Reich was not only blind, it was blind because of a decision made by its own leadership. In one night, the Luftwaffe went from confident hunters to helpless observers watching their own system disintegrate. The irony was brutal. Germany had been defeated by its own forbidden invention. As the surviving RAF crews crossed back over the North Sea, few understood the scale of what they had just done. They thought they had survived a raid. In reality, they had ended an era. The age of mechanical warfare, guns, armor, bombs, had just yielded to a new battlefield, the electromagnetic spectrum. A battlefield where the cheapest weapon could defeat the most expensive defense. A battlefield where visibility itself could be stolen. A battlefield Germany had never prepared for. And as window rained down over Hamburg, one simple truth became undeniable. The Reich wasn't outgunned. It was outsmarted. In Hamburg, radar screens had gone dark. But in Berlin, something far worse was about to happen. The truth was about to land on the desks of the men running the war. For one night, the Kammhuber Line had simply disappeared. But the collapse of a defensive network wasn't just a tactical problem. It was a political earthquake, a silent explosion that tore through the highest levels of the Reich. The reports arrived within hours, clipped, confused, terrified. Würzburg set saturated at all frequencies. Freya reports thousands of targets, system unusable, night fighters unable to acquire even one bomber. Operators declare complete blind state. A billion Reichsmark defense system hadn't been defeated. It had been switched off. 2 days after the Hamburg raid, Berlin convened an emergency conference. High-ranking Luftwaffe officers, radar engineers, physicists, industrial planners, some summoned in the middle of the night, others dragged straight from laboratories. The atmosphere was not analytical, it was funeral. In the center of the room stood Dr. Hans Plendl, one of Germany's foremost radar scientists, a man who had once warned that ignoring new countermeasures was equivalent to inviting defeat. He spoke quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a buried secret. The British have deployed Doppel. Silence. It was not shock. It was recognition. Everyone in that room understood instantly what those words meant, because Doppel wasn't British. It wasn't Allied. It wasn't foreign. It was German. It was the very radar countermeasure the Luftwaffe had invented, perfected, and then banned. Göring's order from 1942, buried and forgotten, had now returned with the clarity of a confession. They had blinded themselves. When Hermann Göring arrived, the room snapped to attention, but no one dared meet his eyes. He read the reports. He read the radar logs. He read Hartmann's statement. We had been rendered blind, useless, overnight. Then he read the final analysis. Every radar set operating at 53 centimeters is now obsolete. The Kammhuber Line cannot function. All night fighter control is compromised. Flak batteries cannot aim. Göring's face tightened, not because he didn't understand, but because he understood perfectly. He was the man who banned Doppel, the man who decided Germany would never use it, the man who believed that symmetrical fear, we won't use it, so the British won't either, was a stable strategy. Now, his entire air defense empire was collapsing. Under the weight of that decision, every failure in Hamburg traced back to him, every blind radar, every unchallenged bomber, every death in the Firestorm. And everyone in the room knew it. But the man who felt the consequences most profoundly was not Göring. It was Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, sitting at his desk, surrounded by reports of destroyed factories, crippled infrastructure, and industrial chaos. He realized something the radar operators could not. Window wasn't just a tactical breakthrough. It was an industrial death sentence. Speer didn't think in terms of radar. He thought in steel, in coal, in workers, in machines, in production numbers the Reich depended on for survival. What he saw terrified him. If the Allies could attack Hamburg with a mere 1.5% bomber loss, they could attack anywhere, again, and again, and again. 6 raids like Hamburg, Speer calculated, would be enough to bring German armaments production to a halt, a total halt. The end of the war, not in theory. In math, he later wrote, Hamburg put the fear of God in me, not because of the flames, not because of the casualties, but because he saw a new kind of warfare, one where his factories were naked, his workers exposed, his industrial empire suddenly built on air. Window didn't defeat radar. It defeated the entire German war economy. The consequences inside the Luftwaffe were immediate and catastrophic. A system, years in the making, staffed by thousands, built with immense precision and cost, was now obsolete in a single night. A line of steel and electronics, erased by a handful of falling paper. Pilots who once relied on exact radar vectors were now sent into the sky with no guidance, ordered to find the bombers visually. By using searchlights and the burning city as illumination, it was a return to 1918 tactics, chaotic, desperate, and suicidal. Without radar, the physics that made 88mm flak deadly simply vanished. Crews threw shells blindly into the sky, hoping for chance hits that almost never came. 2. Counter window. The Reich mobilized over 7,000 top radar and electronics experts, draining vital talent away from U-boats, jet engines, and missiles. Engineers rushed to develop new radars like the Liechtenstein SN2, operating on new wavelengths. But every adaptation took months, and Britain adapted in weeks. The Allies simply cut new window strips to match every new German frequency. Every step forward Germany took was undone by scissors. In the end, the tragedy of the German response was not technical. It was philosophical. Germany believed deterrence would work, that if they didn't use Doppel, Britain wouldn't either. But deterrence only works if your enemy fears the same things you do. Britain did fear retaliation. For 18 months, they held back window, but then the numbers changed. Bomber losses skyrocketed. The Kammhuber Line became too effective. The war turned into a battle of attrition Britain could not sustain. The moment the Allies reached that breaking point, the logic of symmetrical fear collapsed, and Germany, still clinging to it, suffered the consequences. They were not beaten by superior technology. They were beaten by a psychological assumption. They won't use it because we wouldn't. That assumption died over Hamburg, and with it, so did the future of the Luftwaffe. By early August 1943, just days after the first raid, German leadership finally understood the scale of the disaster. Their air defense network had not been damaged. It had been invalidated. Their radar frequencies were compromised permanently. Their fighters were directionless. Their cities undefended. Their engineers overworked and outmatched. And worst of all, the Allies had unlocked a weapon Germany could neither stop nor survive. The Reich had entered a new war, a war of electrons, reflections, wavelengths, and deception. A war they were already losing. Not because their enemies were stronger, but because they had banned the very weapon that could have saved them. When the last RAF bomber crossed back over the North Sea after the Hamburg raid, its crew felt something close to disbelief. They had flown into one of the most heavily defended cities in Europe and returned almost untouched. They didn't know why. They didn't know what had happened in the radar bunkers. They didn't know what had happened in Berlin. They didn't know a billion Reichsmark defense system had died beneath them. For the men in those aircraft, it was a mission. For Germany, it was a turning point. And for history, it was the night modern electronic warfare was born. By the morning of July 25th, 1943, the scale of the destruction was unimaginable. Entier districts flat, dawazech, unu square kilometers burned. Over 42,000 ved. Temperatures reaching 800 degrees Celsius. winds stronger than a hurricane. But even this horror wasn't the true catastrophe. The true catastrophe was what came after. Because Hamburg wasn't a single failure, it was a template, a demonstration that every city in the Reich could now be struck with near-zero Allied losses. Hamburg was not the end. It was the beginning. Window turned a single raid into a campaign. July 24-25, first RAF raid. The Kammhuber Line collapses. July 25, USAAF day raid. No radar, no accurate flak, minimal resistance. July 27-28. RAF returns with 787 bombers. Window blinds radar again. A firestorm ignites, one of the deadliest in history. July 29-30. A third raid. Würzburg sets still blind. Controllers resort to suicidal visual interception. August 2-3. Final major blow. By midnight, half of Hamburg is destroyed or damaged. The Reich now understood. Radar wasn't degraded. It wasn't weakened. It wasn't compromised. It was obsolete. The second most industrialized city in Germany had been held open like a wound, and there was nothing the Luftwaffe could do. Inside the Luftwaffe, the consequences cascaded. A system, years in development, carefully engineered, rigidly structured, now useless. Germany's defensive strategy became improvised chaos. Wild sow. Single-engine fighters diving into burning cities, hunting visually. Zame Sow, twin-engine night fighters guided by fragmentary, often useless reports. These weren't doctrines of strength. They were doctrines of surrender to circumstance. Thousands of Germany's best scientists were redirected to redesign radar, chasing new frequencies, prototypes, and jammers, in a desperate race they could never win. While Germany rebuilt one radar system, the Allies cut new window lengths. A defense industry was fighting scissors. Window destroyed more than radar. It destroyed fear. For 18 months, the RAF had hesitated to use it, terrified of German retaliation. After Hamburg, that fear evaporated overnight. Window was now mandatory on every major raid. And when added to the new Carpet AN, APS-2, active jammers, it created a double-blind environment. Radar blinded by chaff, radar deafened by jamming. By late 1944, over 0 jammers produced. RAF and USAAF raids protected by multi-layered ECM. Flak effectiveness down 75%. Bomber losses down to less than 1% per raid. Window didn't simply protect aircraft. It enabled a 24-hour cycle of destruction. USAAF by day, RAF by night, cities burning in shifts. Germany was no longer defending its airspace. It was drowning in it. Albert Speer's fear was not theoretical. It was mathematical. He calculated that 6 Hamburg-scale raids could shut down German armaments production entirely. And the Allies didn't have 6 raids planned. They had 60. Window did not just blind radars. It blinded the entire industrial heart of the Reich. U-boat pens, steel mills, synthetic fuel plants, Ruhr Valley factories, ball-bearing production lines, transportation networks, each one now vulnerable, each one now a target, each one now undefendable. A war Germany thought it was fighting with tanks and planes had become a war of electrons, and electrons were choosing sides. After the war, German operators and scientists spoke with brutal clarity. Oberfunker Klaus Hartmann, the man who first saw the blizzard, we had been rendered blind. We became useless overnight. A captured Luftwaffe technical report stated, German scientists knew what double was, but refrained from using it for the same reasons as the British. Albert Speer wrote, Hamburg put the fear of God in me. Even Hitler privately admitted, if such raids continue, Germany cannot stay in the war. The most devastating weapon of the air war, the weapon that broke the Kammhuber Line, that crippled German industry, that shattered civilian morale, was not a bomber, not a fighter, not a radar, not a bomb. It was foil, aluminum foil, cut to half a wavelength, dropped by the ton, ignored by high command, feared by everyone. used by the side that finally ran out of alternatives. The lesson of window outlived the war. Every modern military aircraft in the world today, 2025, carries some descendant of those simple strips. Chaff remains a universal doctrine, a permanent reminder that the simplest ideas can break the most complex systems. Window wasn't just a countermeasure. It was a philosophy. Confuse the enemy, blind the enemy, drown the enemy in data he cannot trust. The Battle of the Beams ended in Hamburg, but the age of electronic warfare began there. In that bunker outside Hamburg, Klaus Hartmann never saw a bomber, never saw a formation, never saw a single aircraft. All he saw were echoes, thousands of them, crawling across his screen like a living storm. He thought his equipment had failed. He thought the system was broken. He thought the impossible was happening. He was right, but not in the way he feared. His radar wasn't failing. His empire was. A nation built on steel and discipline was defeated by deception made of paper. A superpower armed with the most advanced radars in the world was blinded by a weapon it had invented and then forbidden. Window didn't change the war. It revealed the truth. When fear stops one side from using a weapon and desperation drives the other to embrace it, the war ends long before anyone realizes it. Hamburg was not just a raid. It was the moment an empire went blind and never recovered. Why an empire went blind and what it teaches us about power, fear, and the physics of decision, asterisk, asterisk. In the summer of 1943, over the burning streets of Hamburg, the world witnessed something unprecedented. An empire brought to its knees not by superior firepower, not by overwhelming numbers, not by industrial might, but by a handful of aluminum strips drifting silently through the night. It is easy, decades later, to view the story of Window as a technical anecdote, a clever trick, a scientific breakthrough, a moment when physics outsmarted steel. But that is not the real story. The real story is about fear, about hesitation, about the catastrophic cost of assuming an enemy thinks like you do, about how simple ideas ignored, dismissed, or forbidden can change the destiny of nations. And more than anything, it is a story about blindness. Not the blindness of radar screens turning to static, but the blindness of leaders who convinced themselves that certain dangers did not exist, because they themselves were afraid to face them. Window was not born on the night of July 24th, 1943, nor was it born in the bomber bays where RAF aircrew tossed bundles into the darkness. Its true birthplace was in the corridors of power, both in Berlin and in London, where men looked at a simple concept and saw not a weapon, not a tool, not an opportunity, but a mirror reflecting their own fear back at them. For 18 months, that fear froze both sides in place. The British made Window. The Germans made Doppel. Both sides tested it. Both sides proved it worked. And both sides refused to use it. Why? Because both sides believed the same thing. If we use this, the enemy will use it against us. It is a perfectly logical thought. It is also the most dangerous logic in warfare, because it assumes symmetry. It assumes your enemy fears what you fear. It assumes your enemy values what you value. It assumes your enemy will remain passive simply because you remain passive. History shows these assumptions are almost always wrong. The moment one side's circumstances change, the moment desperation outweighs fear, the moment the cost of inaction surpasses the cost of risk, symmetry collapses, and the side still clinging to fear is left defenseless. Germany believed Window was too dangerous to use. Britain believed Window was too dangerous to use. But only one of those nations faced a bomber loss rate so high it threatened the very survival of its air campaign. And in July 1943, Britain crossed that threshold. Fear turned into necessity. Hesitation turned into resolve. And the scissors finally cut those 27-centimeter strips that would fall over Hamburg like electronic snow. This is the first lesson of Window. Hermann Göring banned Duple because he feared what it would do to Germany's radar. He feared the possibility that the British would copy it. He feared the loss of his air defense network. In banning it, he created the very future he feared. Symmetrical fear creates vulnerability. When two sides fear the same weapon, the first one forced to act breaks the balance. The other is left holding nothing but its own hesitation. Window teaches us that fear does not prevent danger. Fear only prevents preparation. Throughout history, empires have trusted their strength to the biggest machines, the tallest walls, the most expensive weapons. Yet they are most often undone by the smallest innovations: paper, code, misinformation, a spark, a microbe, a hinge. The Kammhuber Line was a marvel of engineering. Thousands of radars, searchlights, night fighters, coordination grids, communications nets. It represented industrial might, technological sophistication, and organizational brilliance. Window was aluminum foil. One cost billions. One cost pennies. The billions lost to the pennies. The greatest vulnerability of any complex system is the simple idea no one takes seriously, especially if that idea is ignored, not because it is flawed, but because it is frightening. Germany's air defense functioned beautifully, as long as bombers behaved the way they expected, as long as radar behaved the way they expected, as long as the enemy fought the way they expected. But war rewards the unexpected. The Kammhuber Line collapsed not because it was weak, but because it had no flexibility, no redundancy, no capacity to interpret deception. When faced with a situation outside its assumptions, the system did not degrade. It disintegrated. This is true beyond warfare. Corporations collapse from ignored market disruptions. Governments fall from unanticipated crises. Relationships fail under unspoken assumptions. Individuals suffer when they cling to outdated beliefs. Rigidity creates fragility. Window did not merely blind radar. It blinded a system incapable of imagining that its foundational logic could be wrong. When Hermann Göring banned Duple, he did not destroy Germany's radar network. He destroyed Germany's ability to survive the moment the enemy used it. He made a decision that seemed safe, reasonable, protective. But errors in strategy are rarely loud. They do not announce themselves at the moment they are made. They reveal themselves later. In moments of collapse, in screams over radio channels, in radar screens glowing with impossible data, in cities burning without resistance. Germany did not lose Hamburg in 1943. It lost Hamburg in 1942, the moment Duple was locked away. Window teaches us that decisions do not disappear after you make them. They wait. They accumulate consequences. They reveal themselves when you can no longer afford their price. Both Britain and Germany invented chaff. Both sides proved it worked. Both sides shelved it. Innovation requires intelligence. Deployment requires courage. Britain eventually found that courage, not because its leaders were braver, but because the statistics forced bravery upon them. When bomber survival rates dropped to catastrophic levels, the fear of Window was replaced by the fear of losing the war. This is a profound truth. People, organizations, and nations rarely change until the cost of not changing becomes unbearable. Window teaches us that technological breakthroughs matter less than the willingness to use them, and fear is the greatest enemy of that willingness. Germany assumed Britain would never use Window because the consequences were symmetrical. But symmetry exists only in theory. Britain feared retaliation until the bomber offensive was on the verge of collapse. Britain feared exposing its own cities until losing the war became a greater threat. Britain feared the consequences until desperation erased those fears. This is the fatal flaw of deterrence built on symmetry. You assume your enemy will not risk what you refuse to risk. You assume your enemy wants what you want. You assume your enemy fears what you fear. But war does not care about symmetry. War responds to pressure, not to philosophy. Window teaches us to never project our own fear onto the enemy. Fear is personal. Fear is situational. Fear is asymmetric. Window was not technology. It was psychology. It exploited the human belief that a radar screen represents reality. It exploited the trust operators had in their training. It exploited procedures built on order and clarity. It exploited a worldview where signals equal information. Window revealed how fragile perception becomes when an entire system, technical and human, trusts a single method of seeing. This is true far beyond radar. Businesses trust numbers that can be manipulated. Democracies trust news that can be fabricated. People trust narratives that can be twisted. Vision is only as strong as the assumptions behind it. Window teaches us that deception, when applied with precision, can make even the clearest truth vanish behind a cloud of noise. The story of Window is the story of a technological war, decided by something that barely qualifies as technology. Complexity is slow. Complexity requires coordination, training, manufacturing, planning. Complexity breaks in many places. Simplicity moves quickly. Simplicity adapts. Simplicity survives. Window did not just defeat the Kammhuber Line. It exposed its fundamental flaw. The more advanced a system becomes, the more catastrophic its failure when its foundation is compromised. This is true in engineering, in politics, in economics, in personal life. Window teaches us that simple tools, when properly timed and aimed, can collapse entire empires built on the illusion of unbreakable structure. Germany did not lose because it lacked intelligence. Its scientists knew what duple was. Its engineers understood the threat. Its analysts warned of countermeasures. But the decision to ban duple created a delay that could never be recovered. When Window arrived, Germany's countermeasures were months behind. Its radar upgrades were half complete. Its doctrines were outdated. Its assumptions were fossilized. In war, the difference between readiness and collapse is often measured in months, sometimes weeks. The 18 months Window sat on a shelf, where the 18 months Germany never got back. Window teaches us that time lost to fear is time donated to the enemy. No German radar operator was incompetent. No engineer was ignorant. No night fighter pilot lacked courage. Germany did not lose because it lacked strength. It lost because it lacked imagination. It assumed that yesterday's success guaranteed tomorrow's survival. It trusted stability in a world shaped by constant change. It believed the enemy would think the same way it did. Britain, by contrast, embraced disruption, not willingly, but necessarily, not eagerly, but urgently. And urgency is often the birthplace of progress. Window was not a triumph of engineering over engineering. It was a triumph of adaptation over rigidity, of creativity over tradition, of simplicity over complexity. And so, in the darkness above Hamburg, an empire built on steel was defeated by a weapon built on fear. Fear finally overcome. When systems blind themselves, even light cannot save them. Asterisk, asterisk. In the bunker outside Hamburg, as radar screens turned into chaos, Hartmann reported the only truth he could understand. This cannot be real. But it was real. He was not watching equipment failure. He was watching the logical conclusion of decisions made far away, long before he ever sat down at his console. He was watching a nation go blind from a wound inflicted by its own leadership. He was watching the moment when an empire built on certainty collapsed under uncertainty. He was watching history turn because one side feared change and the other side embraced it. Window teaches us the simplest, harshest truth. The deadliest weapon in any war is the idea you were too afraid to use, and the assumption that your enemy feared it as much as you did. That night, over Hamburg, a few pounds of aluminum took away Germany's vision. But fear had taken it long before. And in that sense, the Reich did not go blind when Window fell. It went blind when it decided not to see. Why nations fail, why people ignore warnings, and why the smallest ideas change everything. Asterisk, asterisk. The story of Window does not end in Hamburg. It echoes across decades of military doctrine, political decision-making, and human behavior. Because window is more than a countermeasure. It is a metaphor, a lens through which we can examine every system that claims to be unbreakable, every leader who thinks he can control uncertainty,